Okay, we're live and we're recording. This is Lauren, Mary, Tanya, and John. We are talking about the standards for this week's virtual discussion. And the whole purpose of this discussion is to compare national and state standards to discuss similarities between the standards and how they're different in terms of how they support integrative STEM material. So since all of us are within the biology content area, we decided to pick some biology standards, one from the Next Generation Science Standards and one from the MSDE standards, and compare them. Overall, the two standards, they cover mostly the same content, but they're organized a little bit differently. So the Next Gen standards, we decided they're a little bit more specific, whereas the Maryland standards are quite broad. So for middle school, 7th grade life science, there's only one standard, whereas for the Next Gen standards, they have multiple standards within that category. Standard we chose was standard just 1-1 that we wanted to talk about. And with the Maryland standard, we picked standard 3, topic B, indicator 1, because they have the same topic at hand. And now the standards, they are organized a little bit differently, and I wanted to point that out before we really get into the details of the standards. Like I said, the MSDE standard there's only one of them for life science, and it has 4 subtopics, each with their own indicators and objectives. The one we're talking about is actually one of the indicators because the language most closely matches our standard. Whereas with the Next Gen Science Standards, there's 4 disciplinary core ideas that transcend middle school and high school. And within those, we have individual standards. There are 21 total, and we chose the first one. And it is.
Can you read them?
Yes, that's what I'm going to do right now. So Next Gen Standard MSLS 1-1 is the one we chose. That is, conduct an investigation to provide evidence that living things are made of cells, either one cell or many different numbers and types of cells. Now, the corresponding standard for the MSDE is actually one of the indicators. So standard 3 for MSDE is the students will use scientific skills and processes to explain the dynamic nature of living things, their interactions, and the results from the interactions that occur over time. The indicator that most closely represents the NGSS standard is gather and organize data to defend or argue the proposition that all living things are cellular and that cells carry out basic life functions.
Yeah, and you can pretty much see the difference between the NGSS standard and the MSD indicator just by the use of the language. Like, for instance, the disciplinary core idea under NGSS, it says that with this standard, there features that student performance should be observable by the end of the year, and some of the observed behaviors are to identify evidence and address the purpose of the investigation, to actually plan an investigation, and then also collecting the data, just as an example. Whereas MSDE, underneath their indicator, it just says gather and organize data. It does say also, like, to use microscopes or magnifying instruments, which I think, limits the flexibility in what the teachers are able to do in the MSDE standards, whereas NGSS provides a little more flexibility by not specifically stating, like, like the MSDE does, to use the microscopes, magnifying instruments. It also mentions to base your data from readings. So you're not necessarily investigating if you're reading in order to gather the data. Going along with NGSS's disciplinary core ideas and the 3-dimensional approach that it uses is the science and engineering practices. And for our specific standard that we chose, MSLS 1-1, it suggests that, or I guess it expecting students to conduct an investigation to produce data to serve as the basis for evidence that meet the goals of an investigation. So again, it goes back to they're actually conducting an investigation. The NGSS standard, the wording, it's just more STEM-centric than the MSDE standard or indicator. I found this really great article on ascd.org, and I'll put a link to it in our Google Doc. But it actually talks about like what is an integrated curriculum, and then it goes into discussing the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary like approaches and ways of teaching and how students acquire this knowledge and the roles of the disciplines. And for interdisciplinary, it says disciplines are connected by common concepts and skills. And that really stuck out to me for this standard, because you'll see for MSLS 1-1, it discusses that engineering advances have led to important discoveries in the field of science. So for instance, this standard or indicator requires the use of a microscope. And a microscope, you know, obviously uses physical properties, light, refraction, magnification, and I think Lauren had pointed out to me as well, to integrate technology now, microscopes even have cameras to use. So those, you know, engineering advances are really important discoveries, which are included as part of the NGSS features. So the microscope is an example too of one of the 3 dimensions of the cross-cutting concepts.
I see that you're mentioning microscopes a lot. That was one of the things that's used to get the scale of cells. If we look at the NGSS standard, we see that all living things are made of cells, which we know, and they vary in size and types. From engineers that created microscopes, we now know the exact scale of a cell, the exact size of prokaryotic cells compared to eukaryotic cells, that prokaryotic cells are much smaller than eukaryotic cells, but even though their proportion is smaller to larger, they still produce the same function. They still keep these bacteria cells, animal cells, plant cells alive and keep that organism alive. And the quantity is also different because we know that some cells are unicellular and some animals in general are multicellular, but bacteria is unicellular. And then another thing we can see from cross-cutting concepts is structure and function. So prokaryotic cells don't contain organelles, but eukaryotic cells do, and they still have the same function based on the fact that they both have the same similar chemical reactions happening inside of the cell, even though they might not have the same exact biology inside the cell. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the big themes of this standard is that cells are very different if you're comparing a prokaryotic to a eukaryotic cell or an animal to a plant cell, but the one thing they all have in common is they're all alive. So looking at whether it's an individual prokaryotic cell or a multicellular organism like one of us, our cells are all doing the same things to keep themselves alive. And the whole purpose of this standard is to provide an investigation, to plan one out and collect data to prove that. That's the goal that our students need to achieve. And I think standards do a really good job of deliberately pointing that out to make that very clear to the students, whereas the MSDE standard doesn't quite make that as clear.
Right, the NGSS one expects the students to, after conducting that investigation, make the appropriate connections, versus the MSD one that just says, like, gather the data. Mary, sorry I had to run away for a little bit. I had to get my power cord or I wouldn't be on this video anymore.
I was like talking to a chair for a little bit.
Sorry about that.
Speaking of scales, we can also relate that all cells come from or are living things to different content areas. So for math, there's a lot of math concepts that we can take out of this. We can compare unicellular cells to multicellular cells. We can, design an experiment determining that and graph our data in any way that we see fit. We can also list the characteristics of life in a table form. We can compare, different organisms that are alive versus not alive. And that all requires designing and using a lot of math in relation to this biology content standard. So it's really integrating a different content into the content that we're trying to actually teach. And we can also integrate this into literacy standards. So one of the literacy standards that NGSS mentions that relates to this all living things come from cells standard is to conduct a short research project to answer a question. So essentially that's an inquiry-based teaching approach that would integrate a lot of different ways of learning together. So students would have to do research, which requires literacy. They would probably have to gather some data and make graphs and stuff that would also have to do with math. They'd have to use a lot of technology probably to get this information in the first place, through the internet, through other resources, use the library, etc. And the literacy standard also talks about how students should be self-generating questions. We've learned before that that's a really strong way to know that your students comprehend the material, because students are also often given a question and have to reply with an answer. But if they have to generate a question, there's a lot of background information that the student would have to generate from that. So they would have to do a lot of reading on their own to generate those questions for themselves.
Lauren, can I add something?
Mm-hmm.
I think another addition to the literacy standard is writing as well. I know with the class that I'm interning in now, tomorrow they actually have to, as like a pre-assessment, they need to write up the results of their investigation, just so the teachers can kind of get a feel for, can they write scientifically? So I think that's something else to add too.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Writing is definitely related to literacy. And I mean, as scientists, that's how we publish our data. That's how we share information. So if you can write in a science context, like, you can learn and explore a lot more biology than just being in a classroom.
I hope I didn't ruin your train of thought.
Sorry?
I said, I hope I didn't ruin your train of thought. I was just thinking about that coming up tomorrow in my class.
No, that's fine. The only other point I was going to make is that the end of the literacy standard mentioned by NGSS says that we should focus on questions that allow for multiple avenues of exploration. And I think this is really probably the most important, because when we're teaching students, we want them to just learn the standard. We want them to be able to apply it somewhere else and, be able to keep continuing to learn about it and stuff like that. So combining literacy into biology content, I really feel that it just kind of adds on to what they're learning and gives them the tools to gives them the tools to continue to keep learning about that standard. Whereas the MSDE standards, they don't really mention how this biology standard relates to literacy or mathematics.
Right. I think
that's the big take-home message. You can go ahead, Mary.
I think literacy is really important for science because I've been looking at students' work, like the past quizzes and lab write-ups, and they can't really formulate what they're talking about. What? But
That's
anyway.
funny to me because my mentor teacher was saying, so 2 of my classes are GT classes, and she was saying it's crazy in Maryland that people just throw these intelligent 5th graders into a GT science when they go into middle school, when they've had limited science in elementary school, simply because they're good students. She's like, and some of these kids can't even write. So yeah, if we would follow the NGSS, a little more closely, maybe our GT classes would be a little stronger.
They really can't. They really can't. So they should be reading more articles and textbooks, reading anything, and practicing writing instead of just like throwing a bunch of vocab words together in a sentence, which I have seen. They need to actually formulate their thoughts with literature.
Yeah. I think we learned in our literacy course that, we shouldn't be just teaching literacy in English class. There's a different type of literacy in these science content areas. And, because you can write in English or literature class doesn't necessarily mean that you can use those content-specific terminology to write in biology or math or,
The skills are different when you're writing in English versus writing in science. So one of our standards, it's using data to support your argument. So we want our students to be able to plan some kind of experiment, look at the results, do a little math, and then explain those results to someone else with their writing or their speaking, because that's how in the science community results are shared. If someone does an experiment but they can't communicate that with anyone, that knowledge is lost. So we want our students to be able to scientists in the ways they think, the ways they act, and the ways they read and write as well.
That article that I was talking to you guys about has a really good graphic of an interdisciplinary approach. And it's sort of, I'll put it on the Google Doc, but it has it's almost like a cloud feature, and each bubble of the cloud is, English, science, history. And then within the cloud, it talks about themes and concepts and skills. And it's a really great visual for an interdisciplinary approach.
It is.
Yeah, so I think to wrap it all up, we'd all agree that the MSDE state standards and the NGSS, the national standards, they both ask the students to learn the same biology content for the most part. They both emphasize both the knowledge and the skills to a certain extent, but I think the NGSS standards do a better job of deliberately pointing out those interdisciplinary connections. Right there on the site with the standards, it lists all of the science and engineering practices, the cross-cutting concepts, the connections to the reading, writing, and math standards as well. And I think one of the things I mentioned in my discussion post for this week was that that's really important in STEM, especially integrated STEM, because the students someday, they might forget, what the characteristics of living things are. They might not remember all the things they memorized in biology class, but if they can recognize a pattern or analyze cause and effect, which are the cross-cutting concepts, that's going to help them not only in this class, but in every other class. And you look at the rest of the science practices, being able to ask questions, to plan an investigation, to analyze data, that goes beyond biology and even beyond science in any class, in any avenue in life. Those are important skills.
That's true.
I agree. And another thing, John, I noticed that you researched the NSTA this week for the jigsaw data sheet that we did. The cool thing about that, I didn't realize that the NGSS standards they have on their site also include lesson plans and like possible, like instructional methods, I guess, to use, which was pretty cool, I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, their site's great. It's got a lot of cool resources. And even the MSDE site, to give them some credit, we looked at that for this week's discussion post, I want to say it was. They had some really cool practice tests, past days I didn't know were there. But when I was just perusing the site, I found them. I thought, wow, that's really awesome. That's so helpful.
Yeah, and I actually commented on Liam's discussion this morning. He found like a Chesapeake Bay related STEM lesson plan, and it integrated the 5E model to it, which was really great. Yes, so I don't want to knock MSDE totally. They do have some great stuff on their site as well.
Yeah, and I think the standards are good, but if you were to use them in your class, you have to put in that little bit extra effort to make those connections, because you're inevitably going to get that student that asks, oh, why does this matter? Why do we care? And I think the science and engineering practices, the cross-cutting concepts, the literacy skills, those are going to be relevant for everybody. Even if you have a kid that doesn't like science, those are the skills that they're going to need.
I agree.
That's true.
Well, I have nothing else to add. I don't know if anyone else does.
I think we covered everything.
Yeah, I think so. So if you had to choose the standards to use in your classroom, would you guys all go NGSS, or is there anything else that would sway you the other way?
I think
Go ahead.
I think I would maybe compare both of them, because some might be strong for certain lessons and some might be strong in other areas, and you can kind of integrate them when needed. I'm used to the Maryland ones, so I just like the fact that I know how to navigate through their website easily, but I can, just by going onto the other website, I could probably get used to that website also, so I would just integrate them.
Mary, I have a question. Is Jersey one of the states that uses NGSS? Do you know?
I actually don't. They actually make our lessons. We just have to like tweak it and memorize it.
I'm curious now. I'm going to find out.
Yeah, you should.
I think I looked it up and I put the link in the Google Doc.
Did you?
It's only 18 states plus DC, and I don't think Jersey was one of them.
Yeah, I think
I specifically looked for it.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
then I wouldn't use them.
Well, I would say the MSDE, the one thing I do like about them is the objectives under each indicator. They're kind of like stepping stones to reach that indicator, which is something the NGSS doesn't have. The other thing is the next gen science standards. They can be overwhelming at first because you look at that page and it is huge detail. So I think MSDE's is maybe organized a little bit better. But once you get used to the next gen standards, I think they make more sense for me.
I read somewhere, I guess, on the NGSS site that NGSS is recently published, and the Maryland State Standards, they are, I guess, about a decade old or something like that and haven't been updated recently. I don't really know how much that matters, but I guess, probably now that we have NGSS, maybe the Maryland State might consider some of the NGSS to incorporate when they do update the Maryland content. So I think that would be a good and interesting set of standards to see, like when they update it a little bit more.
Definitely. And it is important to note that on the NGSS site, it says that Maryland has adopted the next generation science standards. So I don't think we use those state standards anymore, and it might be because they're outdated.
That's what I was going to say, John. I don't know if they'll be updated because of us adopting NGSS. And just so everyone knows, Jersey has adopted NGSS. They are one of the 18.
Oh, cool.
But John, like you were saying, using them as stepping stones, I definitely think using like the MSDE standards and getting like a general idea of where what you want to focus on, not necessarily how you want to deliver I feel like NGSS is better for that, but I also feel like there's a lot more unpacking with NGSS standards, and that can be overwhelming if you haven't had some of the classes that we are going to have. So I think some
Yeah,
teachers
definitely.
may be deterred by some of the language in the NGSS.
I think that's true. When we were doing our lesson plans way back in P605, I used both standards, and I think I favored the Maryland ones at the time just because the language is way more approachable.
Yeah.
You go to that site, it tells you exactly what they want the students to know. The Next Gen Science standards, they can be kind of tricky to get into.
At least they provide a link, though, to give you a little more guidance. But yeah, it can be time consuming trying to unpack those standards. But I think I think my preference, I would go with the NGSS way. I just think it allows more flexibility and creativity, which is a more STEM-centric approach.
Okay, yeah, so I guess to answer the question, NGSS better supported integrated STEM. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Last thoughts or comments?
Nope.
We'll just work on the Google Doc then until it's due, and we'll just email to decide when it's ready to be submitted, I guess.
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sounds good. Well, good discussion,
Okay,
everyone.
well, thank you to everybody who's watching this in the future. And thank you to everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Guys.
See you guys later.
Okay.